Pippa, let's start with the very beginning. How did you get into running?
Gosh, well, I guess like everyone else who enjoys running, just through school, you'd take part in the cross country. I wasn't ever the standout talent, but I think with some enthusiasm and my friends taking part, you kind of get dragged along. And I guess I got better every year, which is a good thing. As a youngster, you don't ever want to peak too soon. So I was encouraged to join my local club and I started running for the club, and I always enjoyed other things alongside it. So I think it was easy to just keep going and not put too much emphasis on that one thing. And then I think I started having some success, and that really ignited the fire to continue going and pushing harder. And this was around the time that lots of people were dropping out. It was like 14, 15 years old, and the dropout rates among girls are so extreme at that age. So I guess I was a Remainer, and that meant I would get further. I'd score higher in races, and I think that was exciting.
And when did you realise you could compete internationally?
It's a really good question. I think through doing things like the English schools and having some success there, I managed to win the steeplechase, which back then was a really niche event, and I guess still kind of is. But I loved hurdling and I loved cross country, and it for me was the perfect mix of the two. And I managed to win it, and then came back and won it the year after. And I think through that, it opened the doors to competing internationally in the steeplechase. And then I guess with that exposure and the experience of being around faster runners and pushing yourself a bit further, I was able to run faster times in other events as well. So it was cross country, steeplechase, and 5K was my thing.
And are there any particular standout moments?
I think the World Juniors was the best experience ever. It was so exciting to travel abroad with your team, your country, and to pull on the GB vest. And it was so much fun. I met my best friend, Emily, who is my best friend to this day, just by sharing a room with her there. And she was my bridesmaid at my wedding. We've both had babies at the same time. It's just been the most incredible journey with her. And I never would have met her had it not been for that one event. So yeah, that was pretty exciting. And I was, I think, just 18. So I was really just starting out in my running journey. And those sorts of events really excite you and keep you in the sport, I think, if you're lucky enough to participate in those from an early age.
Love that. And I mean, you had an amazing career. And then when did Reds come into it?
So, I mean, really not that much later, but I guess I was one of the lucky ones to have avoided it throughout my teenage years, when you're really laying down the foundations for your bone health and your mental health, the way you approach your training and your nutrition. I guess I was lucky not to have fallen into the Reds pitfalls sooner, because there are so many and they do really hit the younger age group for the most part. But I had travelled abroad to America to study on a athletic scholarship at Florida State, and it was there that I guess I just put more focus on my nutrition and my training. And it was by then the only sport that I was doing, and it was very serious, and I felt like I had to hone down every inch of my athletic environment just to try to be the best version of myself. And I think I was a bit naive in terms of how I looked at other athletes who were better than me, or, who were competing on the world stage. And I suppose I just looked at their bodies and I thought, wow, I don't really look like that. And I was still developing as an athlete, as a body, as a female. And I overlooked how long that development can take and what shape that takes along the way. And so I just simply thought I could cut out some things in my diet, and I thought that would make me faster. And unfortunately, it did initially make me a bit faster because I lost some weight and I hadn't yet suffered the negative side effects of the condition. And I was completely unaware of it. For years, I didn't have any idea I was doing anything wrong, because everything I was doing was encouraged. People were complimenting my new physique. They were encouraging my clean eating habits and my training. It was all so serious that from the surface, it looked like I was doing everything right.
And what was the moment that you realised that you had to make some changes?
I think there were a few. I remember coming home from America that first Christmas, having been there for 6 months, and realising how much of my mindset had changed. I was suddenly a bit fearful around indulgence. The Christmas period is full of resting and eating things you like. And I wasn't really able to let go and do that. And part of my brain thought, okay, well, this makes sense because I'm now this elite athlete. And of course, I'm not going to be able to do the things that normal people enjoy doing. But the other part of my brain thought, hang on, this isn't me and this doesn't need to be this way. But I just couldn't let that side win. I'd invested so much by then and I'd committed to this American experience and leaving my friends and family back home and things I really enjoyed doing, I'd had to put on hold to pursue this opportunity. I knew I only had a short period of time to do it. So I really wanted to just throw everything into it. And because, as I said, it was working initially, I just could not see that there was another way, another path to take. And then, sure enough, the physical effects of the condition started to take hold about a year into the energy deficit. And that was really subtle. So there wasn't really a light bulb moment. I was just getting ill and injured all the time and thinking that was quite normal for an athlete. And everybody around me reassured me that these were just things you had to deal with as they came up. And we never stopped to look at the bigger picture. And I saw countless physios, athletic trainers, doctors, people who were helping me overcome these small injuries and barriers to my everyday training. But nobody, including myself, stopped to think, okay, is there something bigger going on? It took a while. And then I guess the biggest turning point was when I just couldn't run anymore. It was years in by this point. I think I'd been suffering from RED-S for about 2 years before the fatigue that I was experiencing was so bad. I just couldn't push through it. And then, when you can't do the thing that you're setting out to achieve and you physically cannot push through the fatigue any longer, you have to stop and think, okay, something's wrong. But even then, it wasn't obvious to me. It was the last thing I believed was that I wasn't eating enough or that I was overtraining. It was almost the opposite. I was thinking I was unfit.
And when did you hear the phrase relative energy deficiency in sport for the first time?
Well, I never heard it verbally. It was more a Google search, as you do. Okay. I'd been searching for a lot longer than those 2 years by this point, because once I'd started suffering from the effects of it, I then had to try to piece together the puzzle myself. And so that took me on a real journey of discovering what was really the matter. And I'd found things like the female athlete triad on my search, and I just ruled that out because I had no idea about my menstrual cycle because I was on the contraceptive pill like so many of us were. And frankly, I didn't even stop to think about that. My bone density wasn't being assessed and I hadn't had any stress fractures. So that didn't really factor into it for me. And then as far as an eating disorder was concerned, for sure, I was heavily disordered, but I'd never been formally diagnosed with any kind of eating disorder. So I just pushed past all that. Quite a long time later that I found the term relative energy deficiency in sport, and the other symptoms that were being discussed in that paper were so me. It was like reading a journal about my experience. And that was quite reassuring, actually, because, when you don't know what's wrong and you're searching for answers, it's so frustrating. And you just want to find out what's wrong so that you can improve that situation and get back to doing what you love. So yeah, it was a long journey for that.
And now you've obviously set up Project RED-S, which has been running for a few years to help so many other athletes and people with RED-S. What led you to actually set up Project RED-S?
Well, it had been years by the time I set up the project of my own recovery journey. And I remember feeling during that process, like, how is this so difficult? Because by then I knew what was wrong. I had gone to find a RED specialist who could actually diagnose me and give me some pointers to turn things around. And she did. And it was on paper the most simple thing in the world. It was just take it easy, take a rest and eat more, which I was prepared to do at that point because it had been such a debilitating experience of just not being able to run or even just enjoy my daily life. So I was willing to do that, but that did not prepare me for how hard it was to actually implement things day to day. And every single eating opportunity and exercise opportunity was met with this conflict of, I want to do this, but I know that I have to do this. And there was nobody there to guide me through it. There was no one to talk to about how challenging that was. And it was ridiculous to me how, your average person would really embrace the opportunity of being told to eat more and to train less and take it easy. But for me, it was the most impossible thing ever. And no one was talking about it. So I thought, okay, well, when I've recovered from this, maybe I could help someone else, because I don't want anyone to have to feel like I did when I was just so alone in that experience. So I started mentoring for the British Milers Club, which was actually facilitated by my best friend Emily, who had sort of held my hand through this journey. And that was amazing. I was able to feel like I was giving something back to other people. And then it got to 2021 and it was lockdown. And I was by then working for the National Trust, doing something completely different day to day, also running quite competitively, but not like uber seriously. And I thought, okay, well, I'm on furlough. I've got time and the energy now to try to do something bigger with this. So I set up a website. And my husband is a software engineer, so he was able to do that quite easily for me. And I just started to write all about how I felt, what was challenging for me, what the condition actually is. And then, of course, I felt as though I needed some experts to help corroborate my experience and add some credibility to this, because, it's one thing me just telling people what I went through, but actually they needed professional support. They needed to be signposted towards dietitians, psychologists, medical specialists who could diagnose them. And so together with these very helpful people who were really invested in the cause, we were able to build the project. And it's been going since 2021. I've had 2 children since then, so it's been a bit of a slow burn. But I think we're still gaining momentum. I'm still as passionate about it as I was back then. And it's been amazing to see it grow.
And when you look back at the moment that you were like, I'm just going to make a website and I'm going to write about it and I'm going to bring in experts, to now, what have been some of the major successes so far?
Well, I think watching social media, actually, I think we are so negative about social media as a society, and for very good reasons. But what I have seen over the years has been unbelievable in terms of how people are just talking about this casually in conversations. People are willing to make a vlog, do a reel, talk on a caption about how they have suffered and how that's felt, and how empowering that is for other people who are going through the same thing, or how validating for someone who's not really sure what they're going through but now has a name for that. It has just been incredible. And I'm so proud that we may have played a part in opening up that conversation and not feeling the shame around suffering from something that has historically been potentially stigmatized with its association with eating disorders and, suffering in sport and mental health and things. So that's been a real success as far as I'm concerned. And also just how certain governing bodies like British Rowing, British Triathlon have been invested in talking about this, which is amazing, because they should be. We rely on these institutions and organizations to help us as athletes, guide us towards the healthiest, most sustainable path in sport. And so I'm really happy that that's, been something that I haven't had to push too hard for, and they've been willing to approach us. And also in America, certain organizations and individuals have all banded together to try to change protocols and procedures and improve prevention, which I think is where we ultimately need to work.
And what have been some of the key challenges?
I think there are so many challenges. Ultimately, unless you've experienced something like REDS, it's quite hard for you to listen to advice. It's such a personal experience. It's something that unfortunately does often lead to some favourable results once you're in the beginning stages of the condition. And therefore, if someone is trying to help you before you're ready to receive that help, it can be completely ineffective. It's just a real challenge. And so the prevention side of things has always been the hardest part. We have 3 pillars: prevention, recovery, and awareness. And awareness and recovery are far easier, because before you've experienced it, people are quite interested in, how can we encourage other people to understand the potential pitfalls of overtraining and underfueling. And the recovery side is quite fulfilling. It's great because you're able to impart some wisdom on people who are hungry for that information, and therefore they're able to change their own trajectory. But the prevention side of actually, okay, how can we change the culture of sport has always been a challenge, and I think will be for a long, long time, because these cultures are so ingrained and so harmful in many ways.
And how does Project REDS specifically go into those organisations to try and embed change? There's obviously toolkits, you're doing talks. How does Project REDS Red's mechanisms work?
Yeah, so we deliver talks and toolkits, and we hope that by having conversations and like opening up the dialogue between athletes, coaches, and any member of their support staff, we can break down some of the challenges between people who are suffering or starting to suffer from the initial effects of REDS and seeking support. Because I think that is potentially where we lose the most people down the red spiral, is they start to experience some things that aren't ideal and then they try to push past them, like I did. You know, you might have an injury and it could be a stress fracture or it could be a soft tissue injury, but you don't want to have a big break. And so you just kind of keep it quiet. You get through that injury and you continue doing what you're doing, and then you fall into another one. And I think at this point, if any member of the support team is aware of where else things might be going wrong, you know, asking females about their menstrual cycles, males about their energy levels, their libido, other hormonal factors, we can start to get the ball rolling with the recovery process. So yeah, opening up conversations, toolkits to just help people with the day-to-day things like avoiding any kind of energy imbalance and understanding what normal looks like and what it might not look like. And then constant communication. You know, if any part of the organization is worried about a potential problem, they can come to us and we can signpost them towards the right specialist to talk to, or in our experience, what the right way to go about change might be. So, yeah, it's kind of multi-pronged and it's always evolving depending on which institution it might be. But yeah, it's quite cool to see it change and grow.
It's really cool. And what about the role of parents and guardians in the REDS conversation?
Well, yes. I mean, they have a huge part to play in the overall attitude of the athlete towards things like nutrition and resting and training. And unfortunately, you know, the generation above us, you know, our parents' generation, have suffered from similar harmful cultures, harmful belief systems around nutrition, carbohydrates. You know, they haven't had the benefit of having female specific data to work off. And therefore, some of their own behaviors and practices aren't ideal. They're not exactly the gold standard role modeling behavior. So we try to educate parents and caregivers on how to, you know, be a positive role model, which can be really challenging. But it's also about how they talk to an athlete or how they talk about other athletes in front of their child, and just trying to avoid certain common comments and change the dialogue so that things are a little less focused on appearance and weight and even, you know, the micronutrients that we're focusing on, and just more towards the broader holistic athlete health and long-term well-being of the individual.
And how has becoming a parent since starting Project REDS informed your perspective and how you might mentor athletes?
Well, it's just opened my eyes, I think, to like how invested parents are in their child's well-being, I suppose. And I couldn't ever see myself caring more about how they perform as an athlete than how they are as a human being and how happy they are or how healthy they are. And so I can really see how painful this must be for parents who are watching the person they care most about in the world struggle with something that they potentially can't put a name on, or, you know, they can put a name on, but they don't know how to rectify. You know, we get so many emails from parents every week to just offload, you know, my child is struggling, I don't know how to help them. And it's actually really quite amazing to be able to share advice now from a parent's perspective as well as an athlete's perspective. Even though my kids are like under the age of 3, I can still see how much it will impact someone watching their child suffer.
Yeah, completely. And when you kind of look at the wider landscape of sport and the impact of REDS, the conversation around REDS, how is it evolving? Because it felt like it very much, obviously you're a runner, you swim a bit as well. But, you know, it started very much in the running space. We've got these pro cyclists having these conversations. There's been a pro kite surfer, British triathlon, British rowing. How is it evolving with all these different sports?
It's amazing to see people from all sports and, you know, not even sports, but all kind of walks of life. Dance, which doesn't technically count as a sport, with Project Red D has really been pushed forward into the forefront. But yeah, I mean, the athletes themselves, I'm seeing, are talking, more about this than any kind of governing body per se. And I think they are so passionate about raising awareness within their community that it's incredible to see that has such an effect. And that, again, is why social media can be so powerful, because it exposes so many others within that community to one person's experience, and then you feel able to talk about your own. And yeah, I think what's amazing for me to see is, at the beginning, it felt like very much a female issue. We were talking predominantly about periods and about how, the female body is impacted by an energy deficit. But now we're getting loads of male athletes talking about how they too are impacted. And hey, let's not get left out of the conversation, which I'm really glad about, because we've always tried to include the male voice in our organization and our communication. Yeah, I mean, from all walks of life, from any athlete of any gender, age, experience level, it's been amazing. But the one thing that still, I guess, bugs me a bit is it's still thought of as an athlete issue. And a lot of people who are just generally exercising don't necessarily define themselves as athletes. And therefore, I feel they don't always relate to the content of perhaps our organization or other organizations talking about Reds. And I'm really trying to highlight the fact that it's not just people who train with purpose, it's anybody who exercises that can be impacted by Reds. So that's something hopefully we can do in the near future.
I think that's a really interesting point, because we are seeing so many more people, I guess, get into exercise in whatever form. All these AI training apps that's making it more accessible, things like Park Run. There's the stats of people signing up to an exercise-related holiday are phenomenal. Like, it's massively gone up in popularity, as well as endurance challenges. And, these, as you say, these people wouldn't necessarily call themselves an athlete. In many cases, they are training like them. What does that say in terms of like society? How can we help educate those kinds of people?
I think ideally it would be from the outset. It would be in schools, in universities, talking about how to be a well-rounded, sustainable exerciser. But I suppose if those people aren't focused on sports or even exercise at that age and that level, it's really hard to catch them then. So therefore we rely on the club setup. And if it's not the club setup, then maybe it's the gyms or any exercise environment. We need to be having conversations not just about how well you can perform, but how long you can perform for and how healthily you can train and exercise. And what about your nutrition, and how about your rest days? And I think historically we have always been focused on performance and outcomes and results and who can push the hardest and be the lightest and eat the least. And it's really refreshing to see that start to change in the sports environment. But is that translating into exercise settings? I don't think so yet.
And what role do event organisers have in this? Because again, event participation has also blossomed, which is fantastic. But what about those organisers? What responsibility do they have potentially on the health of their participants?
Yeah, I think far more responsibility than perhaps they even recognise, because I suppose they're very focused on getting people into sport and helping them enjoy that experience. But beyond that is, how can we prepare them for the event that they're about to take part in? And if you're setting up a race or any kind of sports competition, you have to be mindful of how people are going to approach the preparation for that. For a lot of people, especially in endurance sports, they wouldn't have the knowledge of how to train for something in that healthy, sustainable way that we should be trying to promote. And unfortunately, they might fall back on outdated beliefs on nutrition and training, and perhaps research that isn't up to date and especially reflective of the female experience and the female body. So I think they do have responsibility and an opportunity to highlight potential pitfalls alongside offering alternatives for how to approach things and information on where to turn for tried and trusted specialist approved resources.
When you look to the future for Project Reds, what are some of the key opportunities that you see and your hopes in terms of the work that we can do?
So I see a massive opportunity for the term Reds to be as well known as things like concussion. It's something that can and should be avoided and doesn't benefit anybody. So if we can avoid it, then we should. And that should be part of every sports conversation, every exercising conversation, if it can be, whether that's with a focus on the female body or nutrition for different sexes, and really just talking about things more holistically and not just about how far you can go or how fast you can go. And I'd love Project Reds to be at the forefront of promoting that. And we've said all along that we don't care who it is that can help change the culture of sport. If it's us, then brilliant. And we'd love to be part of pushing that forward. But as long as this culture of sport is able to change for the better, we don't mind. That said, we love collaborating with other organisations. And I think that's always been the most fun part of this work, is finding like-minded people who are pushing for the similar cause, trying to make sport a better place, trying to keep people in sport for longer, doing it more healthily and enjoying it more. So that's where we hope to go.
And are there particular sports that you haven't had the Reds conversations with yet that you're really keen to?
I think team sports are maybe flying a little bit under the radar. I think endurance sports are becoming much more aware, but as we know, this can impact anybody who exercises. And I think in team environments, there is the potential for culture to either be really positive and for people to bring each other up and set the standard of, a positive experience, or there is for sure the potential for things to be a little bit more toxic. And I have experienced 2 different universities and 2 different setups where things have been drastically different in terms of our approach to sport as a whole, but also the things that are involved in that experience, like nutrition and training and resting. And one environment was far healthier, far more beneficial for everybody, and everyone was working together and supporting each other. And the other environment was potentially a bit more competitive, less healthy and happy. And I think we should be trying to eradicate that kind of competition, especially at the university level. And even, at any level. I think we're seeing much more now, like women supporting women in sport, but that needs to be, pushed forward into every facet of sport, I think.
Definitely. And just lastly, what advice would you give to an athlete who might be struggling, listening to this conversation and thinking, I think I might need to get some help, and at the same time, either a parent, a guardian, or a friend of an athlete who's thinking, I think my athlete might need some help?
Well, if you're an athlete or anybody listening, I think there's absolutely nothing to lose in seeking some support, whether that's by talking to a friend, a parent, a teammate, your coach, anybody involved in your life who cares about you. There's really nothing to lose, because they might help you see that actually it's not Reds, it's something else, and you might be able to get support for that. Or it might well be that you're falling into some harmful behaviors or belief systems that can be rectified early. And if you've been experiencing it for years and years, it's never too late. And I think a lot of people lose hope at a certain point that they'll ever get their period back, they'll ever be fertile, they'll ever return to a normal, in inverted commas, way of thinking about food or training. But there is always a way back from where you came from. And I think you don't lose hope. I used to say to people that I mentored, if I can get better from this and live a normal life and be able to have children and enjoy sport and food in the same way that my 16-year-old self was able to, then anyone can. So yeah, don't give up. And then for parents or guardians, caregivers, coaches, if you are at all worried, if something tells you something isn't right, then act on it, because you might well be able to save someone years and years of turmoil. And when I think back, it was a decade of my life lost to overthinking nutrition, overthinking training, not ever finding that healthy balance. And it shapes the way you look at things forever and the way you are scarred by this. It's so worth acting on it early and trying to intervene, even if it might be met with some initial resistance or reluctance or animosity even, because it's a personal topic, but that shouldn't stop you trying to push someone towards support seeking. But do try and go about it in a sensitive way, because you don't want to achieve the opposite.
And where can someone find information about Project Reds?
You can find our website at www.red-s.com, or type in Project Reds to Google, And hopefully you'll find everything you need in terms of figuring out what the condition is, what we can do about it, and where to go for specialist support.
Pippa, thank you so much for sharing your story and all about Project Reds.
Thank you so much for having me.